Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura McCusker, and I am the Assistant Director of Educational Services at Lincoln Intermediate Unit 12. And hopefully you are here to see explicit vocabulary instruction on day one of our Summer Institute. Again, here is my contact information. Please feel free to look me up on Twitter or email me with any questions that you might have. My background in the classroom is about 10 years of teaching down in Southern York County before I found my way to the intermediate unit. And as a reading specialist for my master's and then a doctoral dissertation on professional learning, I think it was only a matter of time until I found the intermediate unit. So ever since then, 3 years ago, I've been working with teachers and administrators on how to work in curriculum, instruction, and assessment, specifically towards English language arts. I spend a lot of my time, and one of my passions is in text-dependent analysis. So if you are on social media, check out hashtag TDAIU12 to follow the work that we've been doing over the past few years. Today we are going to continue some of the conversation about MTSS that you've heard from our two keynote presenters, but specifically look at the role of vocabulary instruction. And so the announcements before we get started, one is about Act 48. Please make sure that you complete the evaluation at the end of each day. So today you'll have an evaluation. It is due by the end of the week so that you may receive your Act 48 credit. Our meeting norms are the same for each breakout session. Though engagement is our top priority, it does look different for everyone. So if you can turn on your video, that would be lovely. If you're not in a place to do that, that's fine as well. We're so happy and thrilled that you're spending your time with us. We are going to honor all perspectives and assume good intention, both on the part of the participants and the presenters here. We're all here to increase our student success. The objectives for today are to review what we know about vocabulary acquisition, unpack recommendations for vocabulary, and then explore resources. So first, I kind of wanted to start with a check-in. What is one question you hope to have answered about vocabulary instruction from this session? So I want you to think about that as you review and pay attention and listen out for it as we continue on through. Why vocabulary now? Why talk about this now, Laura? Well, there is a wonderful resource. One of the hats that I wear is on school improvement. And so we're always looking at evidence-based strategies in order to move student achievement. And so at the bottom of the screen on our slide, we see improving adolescent literacy, effective classroom intervention practices. This is a practice guide from What Works Clearinghouse that is also in the folder with the materials for today. And so one of the strategies is to provide explicit vocabulary instruction. That's one of the ways to improve adolescent literacy. The others include comprehension instruction, meaningful opportunities to extend discussion, motivation, and of course, interventions. So we're gonna really unpack that number one today in this session and say, what is explicit vocabulary instruction really about? Another piece that I'd like to bring to your attention is from this morning's keynote. Dr. Amanda Vanderheyden was wonderfully adept when she talked about the fact that we really need to, when we're thinking about MTSS, look at this tier 1.5, because when we start to think about this, the current situation that we all are in, figuring out how it's going to look to go back to school in the fall, we're probably going to need to have some class-wide interventions because of the learning loss that occurred during the school closures. And so how is this different from our core instruction or our tier 1 instruction? It's that now we need to really be aware through data what the progress monitoring is saying. How are they responding, and what needs to be small group versus individual interventions. And so that's one reason that we're kind of prioritizing that for today. Let's start with some of the background. So the way that our brains work is we have a lexicon, a mental lexicon, all of us. And the way we could find lexicon is essentially a dictionary. And so when we see a word, and let's start with a simple word like blue, we automatically associate it with some other things. We might say things like the blue cup, the blue one, Blue's Clues, blue shirt, right? And all of that is in our lexicon around the word blue or in our personal dictionary. And so the mental lexicon keeps in it many different things, not only the meaning of a word, but its sounds, whether it sounds different endings. We have letters, the syntax, and the modifications that we've seen or are aware of to such a word. So there are really lots of different layers when it comes to our own mental lexicon. Lexicons are emergent structures. And so what that means is that everyone's different. And so even if I'm sitting in the same class as someone else, even if I go through 13 years of instruction in the same class as someone else, we're going to have very different lexicons because our experience around the same words that we use is very different. And so lexicons emerge and build themselves, much like the anthill that you see pictured here before you. And so no two lexicons are the same. So what does this mean for instruction? Words are learned in bits and pieces. And so what research says is that we're kind of along a continuum, right, of our word knowledge. All the way on the left from I've never heard a word before, all the way to the right, I know it, it means, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the ways that we see this as an assessment tool for vocabulary is through something called a vocabulary knowledge, right? And so a knowledge rating for vocabulary has students really look at words ahead of time and rate how familiar they are. If you'll click on the image there, then we have an example of a vocabulary knowledge scale there for you, as well as a protocol around it so that you're welcome to use that within your classroom. This is a great strategy for content area literacy because it's quite scaffolded. You can see that with an article or a text, you're able to very clearly pull out what are the words that students need to know and then have them rate them on this scale. So that's an assessment that we see that can be used as a pre-test and can be used as a post-test to help see how students are acquiring vocabulary. Another way that we acquire vocabulary is at the depth of level, right? So our lexicon builds in an emergent structure, but there are some words on there that we know have a very shallow knowledge of, whereas others we have a very deep knowledge and can have conversations with you about that topic for a long, long time. So in order to know a word, there is another continuum that's top to bottom, right? A shallow knowledge is a word in which we're in a very fragile state. We're not sure that we have it quite yet. And then incrementally over time, we get down to a deep knowledge. So this is something that it's within our lexicon. We can use it multiple ways very successfully. So an assessment that you might see to think about knowledge depth is when we're looking at something like this one, a classroom vocabulary recognition task. Let me go down to where that is on here. So the vocabulary recognition task, for example, is a teacher constructed task to help see what words the students already know. And if they already know them, they also need to demonstrate that they do apply about a particular subject. So this article from Reading Rockets is very strong, and it talks about 3 different assessment types that are all related to vocabulary assessment, which is very helpful. So how do we acquire vocabulary, right? We acquire many of our words just through our everyday lives, right? About 1,000 of our words are used in 95% of our daily language and conversation. So those are words that are learned over time through our context and our conversations. However, there are some words, up to about 7,000 other ones, that we will understand once we have been taught them. And so we really need to make that distinction of what are words that our students and I are going to pick up and what are words that need to be taught. So in order to introduce ourselves to the different types of words, researchers have come up with kind of the terminology of tiers of words. And much like the MTSS pyramid, we see a pyramid here of 3 tiers. Number 1 is these words that we see often and we acquire through our everyday speech. Words like stop, go, wave, fan, bike. Tier 2 words are what are sometimes called academic vocabulary, and these are words that are often taught so that students can be successful. Sometimes they are taught alone, isolated, and other times they are taught in the context of a text or a topic that is being taught. Tier 3 words such as tectonics, thermodynamics are words that are very specific to a field or a content area, but as far as everyday speech and outside of a particular course are not used quite often. So let's look at this when we're thinking about a text. So in Tier 1, these are the words that are learned in the early grades, and they're not a challenge to the average native speaker. In this example here, which is a grades 4 to 5 text in the Common Core State Standards Appendix A, we see that words like rock, they, know, works, hot, pushes, crack, way are words that students need to understand prior to attacking the text so that they can understand the relationship between things. These are not the words themselves that trip students up when it comes to reading content grade level text. Tier 2 words here are including spouted, red hot, early versus modern times, layers, solid, formed, eruption, and pours forth. These are words that are more general academic vocabulary words. They span across content areas. Though in the context of this, I might be reading this in science class, I will use the word layers in multiple instances. Early times versus modern times is something that I will understand and continue to explore throughout my lifetime. So Tier 2 vocabulary or academic vocabulary are precise language that represent relatively simple things to say. Tier 3 vocabulary, here we see words like volcanoes, molten crust, mantle, magma, and lava. These are specific to a domain or a field of study. And in this case, we're looking at a science example. These Tier 3 words are also key to understanding a new concept. So if students aren't able to define the Tier 3 words, chances are they haven't completely understood that concept that is being presented. These are more common in informational texts. In fictional texts, we don't see as many Tier 3 unless it is again, adding to a new world that the students are to be learning about. Tier 3 words need to be explicitly defined by the author. So if we think of where Tier 3 words are, they're often given text features. For example, I might have an image of a volcano. And that way, students are able to associate this Tier 3 word with something that helps activate it and add it to their lexicon and their emergent schema around that word. Let's take a look at this example. Our last one was from grades 4 through 5. This is a grades 6 through 8 complexity. This is an excerpt and it's from Freedom Walkers. So I'd like you to look through here and circle on your screen any Tier 2 words. When we think about the 3 tiers, we really want to be very aware of what are the Tier 2 words that will span across content areas, because that's where the bang for my buck is in working with students. If I can use this word with students in English and then someone else can use this word in history, students build to those emergent structures and their schema or their lexicon builds very strongly over time. So let's take a moment and look through here. Do you notice any Tier 2 words? Absolutely. When we look at tier 2 words, I'm going to use the same colors as our slides before. We see things like second class, worship, obstacle, literacy, rigged, disqualify, harassment, grievances. In all of these examples, if I would isolate these words outside of the text, you might not be sure what discipline I'm speaking about. And so that's how we know that they're those academic or general vocabulary. Now, tiers of words don't speak to the type of word. We're really looking at as far as how students should understand them. Tier 2 words are really about their applicability across content areas. Sometimes, in order to understand the tier 2 words, students need to understand the big rocks of the tier 3 concepts that are domain specific. So if I would put all of these words and take them out of the text, students might not come to the realization that we're talking about civil rights here, because I haven't used any of those words. When I look at tier 3 words, however, now I will get to the content of the text, where we're really looking harder at the field of which this text is about. When I underline the tier 3 words, which are in blue, we see things like racial segregation, Jim Crow, white supremacy, segregated, poll tax, and registering. Now I can see in what way am I connecting the idea of worship, right? But I'm connecting it to civil rights. In what way am I talking about obstacles, grievances, disqualify? When I know that second class is not talking about a ship, but talking about white supremacy, now I'm able to anchor my understandings of the word second class into what it could mean. So when we see the tier 2 and tier 3 pieces, then we can kind of put them together. This is a great activity to do with educators, as they're planning their lessons, because one aspect of this is to think about what are the words that students are struggling with, right? But then another piece is, how are they going to understand those words? What are the instructional moves that we need to make to help students be successful? So the way we contextualize all of this information, now that we know how vocabulary acquisition happens and we know about tiers of words, how does this apply to my instruction? And so under close reading, I really like this graphic. I come back to it time and time again because it takes such a large concept of close reading and really puts it down into what are the roles of the teacher and the student. This is sourced from Close Reading of Text, from Supporting Students in Close Reading, which is a publication out of Crest. I highly recommend that you check it out. It is a bit of an overwhelming packet, but it's really great information and takes you through how we should plan as literacy educators. So looking closely, the teacher role within close reading includes selection of challenging and appropriate text, and analyzing the text content and language ahead of time in order to anticipate the potential challenges. And this is huge when we think about our diverse populations. Our English learners, our special education students really might struggle with some of the vocabulary in a text more than any of the comprehension of the text itself. So how does this apply for students then? Well, students are being charged to, let me get out of this for a moment, to when in close reading, they are reading the text more than once. They are persevering in reading. So even if they come across vocabulary that is difficult to them, they're challenged to persevere and then analyze the text for its purpose and or the levels of meaning. So when we think about it in that light, we see that the looking at the vocabulary piece occurs pretty early into our close reading process, but can continue down throughout. Another graphic that I use when working with teachers in one of my roles as an instructional coach is to help them think through close reading planning as more of a linear process. So taking some of that same language that we just looked at, selecting complex text, to creating an analysis task, to answering that task, planning text-dependent questions, and scaffolding instruction. Along the way, vocabulary is very important in all of those pieces. And so I can give you some examples of how that looks when I'm working with folks on text-dependent analysis lesson planning. One piece that I really like to use when it comes to evaluating those complex texts is a text complexity worksheet like this one. This one is one of my favorites. It's pretty easy to use. If you click on the link, it will take you out to the PDF itself. But when you're looking at the different domains of text complexity, there are three. One is looking at the quantitative analysis. This is what you're used to with Lexile level. Two is the qualitative analysis, not the numbers or how difficult the words are, but thinking about the content that's in those words and those syllables. And the third domain is reader and task. And so all three of those things together are part of a process to evaluate text complexity. So if I was going to do this the long way, then I would look at a text and I would figure out what are the language features that are difficult about this text. Is the language itself explicit and literal, making it less complex? Or is it archaic, unfamiliar? Is it full of discipline-specific words and complex sentence structure? Those are the pieces that are going to help me figure out the vocabulary impact of any text that I'm selecting for classroom instruction. Another place where vocabulary may come into play is when I'm looking at the knowledge demands. Some texts assume very little that the reader has to know in order to be successful, while others that are more complex have a subject matter that's uncommon or unfamiliar, relying on the reader to have a specialized or theoretical or discipline-specific content knowledge. I often think of the example, again, we're teaching students to be college and career ready, but just ready for life. And I like to think of the example of if my dryer would break tomorrow, then I'm going to need to figure out what to do about it. And so the first piece that I'm going to turn to is the text that came with my dryer. I'm going to pull up the user manual and I'm going to figure out what is happening. Do I need to call for assistance? Can I fix it myself? Do I need a new part? How much might it possibly cost? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that manual. I don't have any prior knowledge on how the parts of a dryer work or electrical background. However, I'm going to read through it and use what I've learned about words to figure it out. But as I'm approaching that text, I know that that text is going to have a high knowledge demand for me. If it's written as a really great manual, it might be a little bit easier for me to do. I also will know that because it's a non-informational text or a nonfiction text, that the language I hope will be pretty explicit, but it might have some complex vocabulary and words and phrases that it's using. Why did I show you this? I did say this is the long way. So in a little bit, I'll show you some tools that will help you look at the vocabulary of a text to help you decide what in fact is it making it complex. We need to select from a complex text the vocabulary that we're going to use. So in the example we looked at before, we really want to think about those tier 2 words and then the tier 3 words as well. We can use these questions to help ask questions to figure out what those words should be. Question 1, does this word occur more often in written text than spoken conversations? Number 2, is this word relevant to many disciplines? And number 3, can the words be explained in kid-friendly definitions? One of the resources is learnersdictionary.com. If you're having trouble defining a word, like let's say molten from our example, then I'm going to put it in here and I can define it for my students as melted by heat. And so once I have an easier way to explain that word in a kid-friendly definition, it makes itself more a likely candidate of a word that I should teach to students directly. If the answer to these questions are no, you still could teach it to the student, but those tier 2 words may just be beneficial for students to either skip as they're reading or find the tier 3 word that's larger for them to understand. So it's dependent. But any yeses to this, if you have a 3 yes test here, then those are great words to select to teach to your students, whether they're tier 2 or tier 3 words. Oh. Okay. So how am I going to make this part of my classroom instruction? Explicit vocabulary instruction includes 2 pieces. Part 1 is to provide students explicit instruction to a small set of very important words. So this is robust instruction of at least 5 words per week. And what we mean by robust instruction is that we're providing the lexical or the dictionary definition information. We're also providing the phonological information, its pronunciation and its phonemes. We provide orthographic information and syntactic. So over and over again, we talk about its relationship with others around it and how to define that word. Part 2 of our vocabulary instruction model is to provide students with implicit instruction. Remember at the very beginning how I said that 1,000 of our words are used in everyday speech, and that's how many students learn them? How do we do this? We set conditions where students can have conversations, experience read-alouds, and play with words. Having a word-conscious classroom really helps students acquire vocabulary knowledge in a pretty implicit way, which is super helpful. We also have, through the sheer voluminous amounts of words read, that implicit instruction happening as well. So this is why wide reading is such a strong practice. So let's go back to this robust instruction or highly informative exposure. In this instance, when we encounter a tier 2 word that meets the criteria of one that should be introduced to students, we want to identify the word, define the word, extend the word, contextualize it, and have children say it. So let's look at an example. Let's say that I'm reading through, now this is a more primary example, but let's say I'm reading through a Mo Willems book, right? Hopefully by now, all of you have had the pleasure of meeting the penguin, who subsequently has landed in each of Mo Willems' books ever since his first publication. On this page of Pigeon Finds a Hot Dog, the pigeon says, if you've never experienced the splendor of a hot dog, you should really. Let's take some of those words. On this page, we might need to teach experienced, splendor, because those are words that students might not know, and they might pass our test. So for experience, because this is a word that will be used in writing in multiple domains and has a kid-friendly definition, it's one that I should teach. So in order to identify the word, I'm going to say experience is a power word. It's a power word because it allows us to express ourselves very clearly. Instead of thing, we're going to call it an experience. Then I'm going to define the word. And in my kid-friendly definition, I could say experience means to do something or feel something. Then to extend it, I'm going to make a connection to something else that the students are familiar with. We have experiences every day in our classroom. Then I'll contextualize it into their world. An experience we had earlier today was going to the park. We experienced the park. And then we need to have children say the word. Let's all say the word experience together and have a choral response where every student says experience. Research I've seen says that students need to see and interact with the word up to 17 times before they can get that deep knowledge. So we need to ensure as educators that we're not the only ones using the word. We really need to push students to be using this more academic vocabulary in their classrooms. Though it's on a bit of a separate topic, classroom discussion is certainly an area that I see as a weakness as a system, because when we say the words and we're working very hard as teachers, but students aren't using that same language in our classroom, then we wonder about how well those words have been added to their lexicon. And so in order to have students build up that emergent structure around the word, we need them to use it as often as possible and have this highly informative exposure to a new word. Now I'm going to look at a different, the same resource from the beginning. And you'll notice, we talked at the very beginning about this What Works Clearinghouse practice guide, and that it suggests that providing explicit vocabulary instruction is one of the 5 pieces that will lead to effective classroom and intervention practice, or ELA. So what does that mean according to the authors here? To provide explicit vocabulary instruction, we're going to again give direct instruction in word meaning to up to 5 words in the week. This might be a great thing to chunk over time. So for example, many of your materials or your textbook sets might come with vocabulary cards. And those vocabulary cards are to be given over a week's time or a unit's time or a story's time. And you'll notice that should be a smaller number set, and it's over many words for repeated exposures. We also might not have resources like that. So if that's the case, then we want to look at the text that we are using and the topics that we are discussing with our students, and we want to pick out 5 words a week to explicitly teach to them, contextualize, extend until they're familiar with them. And so as we pick those out, that could be part of a warm-up each day, that they do an activity with vocabulary. The second piece of providing explicit vocabulary instruction is also that we promote independently vocabulary acquisition. So this includes such things as teaching semantics, syntactic or context clues to help students determine the meaning of words when they are reading by themselves. And so here's where we see the explicit strategies that you can teach students of root words, base words, suffixes, affixes. They're all independent pieces that students can utilize in order to help themselves uncover new words. We also have the role of context clues, where students are to read for meaning and interpret the meaning of an unknown word as well. There is a place for both the direct instruction and the independent within our classroom, because students will not always be learning in a situation where we can lead them to the words that they need to know. In order to choose words, we already talked about selection of words, but this resource reinforces either using the frequency of words in instructional materials or identifying the tiers and simply teaching the tier 2 words as 2 foolproof things. We talked about using tier 2 words, but we have yet to talk about using the frequency of words in instructional materials. Earlier, when we looked at the example around volcanoes, students needed to understand the word layer in order to know how all of those ideas were working together. The word layer was used multiple times throughout that passage. So the repetition of it signaled to the students that it was an important concept. This occurs for informational text, but also fiction text. Here in fiction text, we see that big ideas, maybe such as theme, are led to by repetition. We also can see how tone and mood can be influenced, as well as character, behaviors, attitudes, by repetition of the same things and pieces of evidence over time and time again. What are some of the ways that we know we can build a vocabulary classroom to help with this instruction? The first, as part of our little checklist, is to dedicate a portion of regular classroom lessons to that explicit vocabulary instruction. By having it be part of your lesson plans, you are honoring that it needs to be part of your classroom instruction, and that really helps set the tone for students that this is going to be a classroom in which we explicitly learn words, and that way they can take those strategies and apply them also on their own. The second way to make sure this is embedded in our classroom climate is to provide repeated exposure to new words in multiple contexts. So that includes when you read one story, having the words, and then also possibly partnering it with outside examples of use of that word, or even a secondary text to show how an author might use the word in a similar way or in a different way. In this sense, we need to give sufficient practice sessions for our students where they can see a word up to, again, those 17 times to start to add it to their mental lexicon. A third way to make sure that vocabulary instruction is in our classroom is to give sufficient opportunities to use new vocabulary in a variety of contexts. So discussion, writing, extended reading. Some ways that teachers can even encourage this is to be a little more formal in that the words that you study may need to be utilized in a response. One way that I like doing this is by, after reading a fiction text or even an informational text, providing students with a list of 5 of the key terms that were in that passage, and having students write a summary or a retelling using and stringing together those 5 words. Students must demonstrate that they can recognize and understand the relationship between those words if they are doing that. The last way that we can embed this into our classroom is to provide students with strategies to make them independent vocabulary learners. One way that we might do this is to isolate a particular skill, whether it is some morphology and context and instruction around root words and base words and suffixes. Another way we might do this is looking at context clues and helping students understand the different ways that pieces are together. We also might have them look at text features and learn that a picture and a caption and a glossary all may help understand the tier 2 and even the tier 3 words, especially within our instructional materials. Earlier, I mentioned that the implication for planning for us is to determine the words to pre-teach. When we select a text to be at the center of our lesson, we need to be able to figure out what are the words that are best. So there are 2 tools that I'd like to show you. One is called the Academic Word Finder at Achieve the Core. The way that you use this is create a free account on achievethecore.org, and from there you are able to copy and paste any text into this word finder. We took a section from, I believe, let me see what this is from. I think it's part of Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And we selected 9th grade and copied this in. When we hit go, then all of these words were pulled out for us. 31 of these words were already underlined, and the way that Achieve the Core does it is they underline yellow words for below grade level words, green words for on grade level, and then red words for above grade level. And so here, depending on the group of students that I'm working with, I might need to or be able to front load some of this vocabulary, and I can make the decision on what are the words that I think are most important to teach. So those results are available for you to then utilize with your students. What's nice here is that you're also then provided with a definition and an example sentence, as well as the part of speech. So you can already get into that robust vocabulary instruction with your students about any of the words. Another resource that's also free of charge is Lexile.com's Analyzer. Oops, let me log in. Again, you can have a free account here, and from the free account, you will be able to analyze up to 1,000 words of an excerpt at a time. What I would do here is I could take that same piece from Letter from a Birmingham Jail, put it into the analyzer, and hit the word analyze. Looking at these 800 words, the Lexile.com analyzer was able to give me a Lexile range so I could see how appropriate this was for my students. And then also it provides me with an overview, the longest sentence, recommended books. This might be important because here's where our students might struggle a bit. It might include lots of vocabulary together in one spot. Indicators section really explores why this text is complex. Looking at this example, the sentence length in Letter from a Birmingham Jail is very long, which makes it harder to understand or more complex in this area. Harder texts have more rare words. Easier texts have more common words. So this goes into what makes this text a bit more complex, not from the number side, but from those green boxes of this that I showed you earlier. What is making it from the content or the qualitative analysis so difficult? But I really wanted to show this to you because of the vocabulary. Again, it's set up a little bit differently, but Oxford Dictionaries here powers the vocabulary piece. And so here it's not broken up by above or below grade level, but you can see that Oxford Dictionaries recommends teaching these words to students based upon the Lexile range and the words that are in here. You'll notice we have a Spanish analyzer available, and if you're teaching something that's quite well known, let's say Animal Farm, then you can even search and find in the Find a Book. Whoops. Let's go back for a moment. I got lost. Okay. So in Find a Book, I can either search what I am trying to find the Lexile for, or I can even choose by Lexile range what I am looking for. Those two tools make planning for vocabulary instruction much more accessible, but I still don't recommend doing it alone. Planning for close reading is very difficult. Planning for vocabulary instruction takes a lot of time. And so please take the time that you have with your grade level partners to go together and work on a text and pulling out vocabulary words together that you can teach to your students. Create activities that students can do in small doses so they get that repeated exposure of the words over and over again. So as you're looking at texts and as you're exploring topics and themes, students are able to incrementally grow their lexicon with the words that they are learning. This part is to be a question and answer about problems of practice for vocabulary, which you can consider on your own. If you found this information helpful, if you're someone whose ears perked up at text-dependent analysis when I mentioned that earlier, consider joining us for TDA on a virtual symposium the morning of Friday, October 9th. We will have an asynchronous access as well as synchronous on that day. One last resource that I have to really celebrate with you is Quizlet. For vocabulary instruction, Quizlet has been a place to go for a long, long time. Quizlet is the essence of virtual flashcards for vocabulary words, but the way that I interact with it is so much more than that. I can create, for example, a list of any words that I'd like with a free teacher account, and students are then able to automatically use flashcards, use interactive matching, etc., and feedback on it, all built in that does not involve me. They can write, spell, take a test, and if they like playing, there are different games. There's a match game, a gravity game that goes down across the street, and then my favorite, which is live. Quizlet Live is a wonderful activity where students are able to collaboratively talk about word knowledge. You can put your students into teams or individually. And since the school closures, I have worked in Quizlet as well, and I've subscribed so I can use the individual feature. So you can play Quizlet Live even when students aren't together. So if I select any one of my lists in Quizlet, I can just press the live button and I'm going to select one way to play. And then students would get this live join code. I would then be able to put those players on teams together and they would have a matching game that's a race to a finish. Students have to match words in their definitions, but if they're on a team, they have to collaborate with one another because the words and their definitions might be on separate student screens. So it really incorporates some of our 21st century learning skills of collaboration and communication in addition to that vocabulary learning. I also like from Quizlet that there is a repository. I could search for study sets on any topic that I might be working on, and then I would be able to find things on content areas, for example. There might also be pieces that I already need. You could make groups that are from your particular series as well and put them there. And once I have an account on my own, I have the option to add that study set to one of my classes. I can copy it and customize it. I can share it out with students, etc., etc. So Quizlet has remained a very strong vocabulary tool to use with students, whether you teach ELA, content, or any grade level of student. I want to thank you for coming in today to hear about explicit vocabulary instruction. For your evaluation, you're going to respond, did this meet your expectations? How will you share or use this? What key information resonated with you? And then, of course, we have the link back to our day one schedule. Thank you so much for being here with us today at our Summer Institute talking about MTSS academics. Please consider joining us tomorrow for MTSS behavior, as well as day 3 focusing on inclusive practices. We are honored to serve you here at IU 12. Have a great rest of the day.